Imagine waking up, pouring your morning cup of coffee, and just looking out your kitchen window at this serene stretch of ancient woodland on your property.
Sounds pretty ideal, honestly.
Right. But now imagine that overnight someone drove a fleet of heavy goods vehicles right through your gates, and they just dumped 30,000 tons of illegally processed, toxic, asbestos-filled waste.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, just completely crushing the trees, poisoning the soil. And then the local authorities arrive, they inspect this massive environmental disaster, and they hand you the bill to clean it up.
I mean, it sounds like some sort of dystopian legal thriller, doesn't it? But unfortunately, that is the baseline reality for rural businesses in the UK right now. We are looking at a system where the foundational element of our survival, the land itself, really is under siege from multiple highly complex directions.
Exactly. And welcome to this deep dive. Today, we are really shattering that idyllic pastoral postcard view of farming you might have in your head. You know the one, right? The green rolling hills, a tractor humming in the distance, just this general sense of timeless tranquility.
Yeah, the countryside is a theme park, essentially.
Exactly. We have a massive stack of sources today, completely drawn from the March 2026 edition of Farming Monthly National. And our mission here is to take you past that pretty scenery and into the incredibly complex, high-stakes reality of the modern rural economy. So, okay, let's unpack this because the sheer volume of topics in this single magazine issue is just staggering.
It really is. I mean, reading through it, it's quite overwhelming.
It's all over the place. We're bouncing from existential inheritance tax threats to the precise amino acid profiles of organic dairy rations, and then to political polling in Wales that is completely defying historical trends, not to mention the organized crime rings we just talked about.
Right. And while that sounds like a wildly disparate table of contents, every single one of these sources actually shares a profound philosophical through line. I'm going to set a calm tone here because this is crucial. They all revolve around a single, finite, and deeply contested resource, which is land.
Land, yeah.
Every issue we're going to explore today ultimately comes down to a fundamental tension over who gets to control that land. Who is allowed to extract profit from it and who's legally and financially responsible for protecting it. We are really talking about the clash between abstract, top-down policy and the gritty biological reality of the ground beneath your feet.
That's a perfect way to frame it. Let's start with the policy side then, specifically what the sources describe as the most immediate existential threat to the family farm. It's this legislative change looming on the horizon that could literally alter the physical landscape of the countryside faster than any flood or drought. I mean, we're talking about the inheritance tax time bomb.
Yeah, the Finance Act 2026. Specifically, we're looking at the upcoming changes to agricultural and business property reliefs, which are generally known as APR and BPR.
Right, APR and BPR.
According to the analysis provided in the sources by Assets, they're a top 10 UK accountancy and advisory firm. By the way, the fuse on this legislation is basically burning down to April 5th, 2026. After that date, the way generational wealth and land transfer operates in the agricultural sector, well, it fundamentally fractures.
I was looking at the mechanics of this legislation, and the shift is just drastic. Previously, these reliefs protected the transfer of active farmland from generation to generation, right?
Yes, exactly.
But under the new rules, 100% tax relief only applies to the first 2.5 million pounds of qualifying assets per individual. Anything over that threshold only receives a 50% relief, which means the remainder is subject to a massive tax hit.
And this raises an important question, right? Does the architecture of this legislation actually account for the unique, highly capital-intensive nature of food production? Because to someone living in an urban center, perhaps renting an apartment and earning a standard salary, well, 2.5 million pounds sounds like an astronomical amount of personal wealth.
Oh, absolutely. The immediate assumption is that anyone holding that kind of value is some wealthy land baron who should absolutely be taxed heavily upon death.
Exactly. But farming completely breaks standard economic models of wealth and inheritance. It just does. If you have a tech startup valued at 5 million pounds, you likely have investors, you have liquid capital, you have shares you could sell off.
Right, you have options.
But if you have a farm valued at 5 million pounds, you are essentially trapped in an illiquid reality. You're dealing with physical capital that cannot be easily partitioned without destroying the underlying business itself.
Because you can't just sell off a chunk of a tractor.
Precisely. The sources make it clear how quickly a modest working family farm blasts right past that 2.5 million tariff throws. I mean, you have to factor in the market value of the land itself. Then you add specialized infrastructure, like grain silos or climate-controlled potato storage. Then the livestock and the machinery.
I read that a single modern combine harvester can cost hundreds of thousands of pounds on its own.
Oh, easily. So a family might be operating a business worth £5 million on paper, but they're only drawing a very modest annual income, literally just enough to cover living expenses and reinvest in next season's seed and fertilizer. They are the absolute textbook definition of asset-rich, but cash-poor.
I really want to use an analogy here to make the sheer operational panic of this relatable to you, the listener. Imagine you run a multi-generational family bakery in a neighborhood that is rapidly gentrified over the last few decades.
Okay, I like this.
So the physical building you own and the massive bespoke industrial ovens inside it, they are technically worth millions of pounds on the current commercial real estate market. But your business model is just baking bread. You make a modest working-class living selling loaves to your neighbors.
Right, you're not a real estate mogul, you're a baker.
Exactly. And you want to pass this bakery down to your children so they can keep feeding the community. But the government steps in and demands a massive cash payment for inheritance tax based on the gentrified real estate value of the building. Your kids don't have hundreds of thousands of pounds in liquid cash.
No, of course not.
So the only way to pay the tax is to sell the ovens or sell half the building to a developer. But if you sell the ovens, how do you bake the bread?
You don't. That's the tragic reality. The business collapses under the weight of its own paper valuation. Robert Anderson, who is a partner at Assets, quoted extensively in the sources, he warns that this is exactly what will happen to farms across the country. Parcels of land will inevitably need to be sold off simply to fund these inheritance tax liabilities.
Which ruins the farm, right?
Completely. An agricultural enterprise is a highly calibrated ecosystem. It relies heavily on economies of scale. You cannot simply slice off a third of a farm's acreage, hand it to a neighboring megafarm or a housing developer, and expect the remaining two-thirds to remain economically viable for that family.
And what makes this so punishing is the retroactive trap that's detailed in the sources. I mean, you would think a farmer could just read the writing on the wall today and gift the land to their kids immediately to avoid the April 2026 deadline.
You'd think so, yeah.
But the legislation has a built-in snare, doesn't it?
It does. It's the 7-year rule. If a farmer gifts the land post-budget, attempting to pass the business to the next generation early, but then they happen to die after April 6th, 2026, and within 7 years of making that gift, well, the new restrictive tax thresholds still apply.
That puts families in absolute paralysis. Rebecca Colmy, another expert from Assets, points out how poorly this was rolled out. The restrictions were announced essentially immediately following the 2024 budget, but the draft legislation, the actual rules of the game, didn't appear until July 2025.
Which meant rural businesses were trapped in this void of uncertainty for months. They couldn't restructure, they couldn't confidently hand over operations, and they couldn't calculate their liabilities. And all the while, the clock is ticking loudly toward April 2026.
And the most frustrating part is the government actually had an alternative blueprint they just chose to ignore. The sources reference a report from May 2025 called The Vision of Farming. I read through the notes on this, and it seems the industry wasn't asking for zero taxes for everyone. They were just asking for nuance.
Yes, the agricultural sector recognized the government's concern. The state was worried that outside multimillionaire investors were buying up agricultural land not to actually farm it, but simply to use it as a tax haven to shield their wealth.
Right, which nobody wants.
Exactly. So the Vision of Farming report suggested a highly targeted approach. They said, let's focus the 100% agricultural property relief strictly on genuine working farmers. Prove you are actually producing food and your business is protected.
But instead of using a scalpel to excise those tax-avoiding investors, the draft legislation just used a sledgehammer. The blanket 2.5 million threshold catches everyone, the wealthy investor and the fourth-generation dairy farmer alike.
And the collateral damage of that sledgehammer approach is a severe psychological crisis in the countryside. The sources touch on this, and it is arguably the darkest element of the entire magazine. Robert Anderson reports meeting farmers weekly who are just overwhelmed by an immense misplaced sense of guilt.
Guilt? Why guilt?
Because older farmers are sitting at their kitchen tables doing the math and realizing that if they manage to live past April 2026, their eventual death will trigger a tax bill that could dismantle their family's heritage. They literally feel they are actively harming their children's financial future simply by staying alive.
Wow. That is an astonishing burden to place on an elderly population. You are essentially legislating a scenario where a parent feels their continued existence is a financial liability to their descendants. That's bleak.
It's incredibly bleak.
And there is no easy legal fix, right? Like, you can't just buy some off-the-shelf trust structure to make this go away.
No, not at all. Trusts are incredibly complex legal instruments, and the assets experts explicitly warn against viewing them as a silver bullet. Every farm has a unique combination of land use, family dynamics, and operational structures. Establishing a trust requires bespoke, meticulous planning, and even then, it doesn't eliminate the underlying reality that the state is fundamentally altering the mechanism of rural succession.
Well, when you threaten a community's livelihood like that, their intergenerational heritage and their psychological well-being, that frustration inevitably bleeds into the ballot box. You don't just endure that quietly. And that transition from economic anxiety to structural political realignment brings us to our second major topic, looking specifically at rural Wales.
Yes, the political polling data presented in these sources isn't just a minor fluctuation. It represents a tectonic shift in voter loyalty. We are looking at a census-wide poll that was commissioned by the Countryland and Business Association, or the CLA, and it's specifically focusing on the most rural seats in Wales ahead of the next Senate election.
Just to give our global listeners a bit of context, the Senedd is the democratically elected Welsh parliament. They're responsible for a wide range of devolved powers, which includes agriculture, the environment, and local government. So this poll is a direct measure of how rural citizens feel about the lawmakers governing their immediate surroundings.
Exactly.
And the numbers for the traditional powerhouse, the Labour Party, are just catastrophic. In these rural constituencies, which hold roughly a third of the Welsh population, by the way, Labour is polling in fourth place at just 13.5%.
It's a massive drop. They are trailing Plaid Cymru at 22.3%, Reform at 16.7%, and the Green Party at 14.5%. And to really understand the depth of this collapse, you have to look at the retention data. Nearly 1 in 3 traditional Labour voters in these areas report abandoning the party entirely.
1 in 3.
Yeah, and only 47% of people who voted for them at the last election are satisfied with their past vote.
I dug into the crosstabs on why they are abandoning ship, and this is where my assumptions were completely challenged. You would think, given the agricultural context, that these rural voters are demanding massive tractor subsidies or the rollback of environmental regulations or purely farming-centric policies.
Right, that's the stereotype.
But their top concerns are almost entirely structural and societal.
Very much so. 37% of respondents cite the cost of living as their absolute top priority. 33% cite affordable housing. That is followed closely by planning delays, rural crime, and poor broadband connectivity.
They aren't asking for special treatment. They're asking for the baseline infrastructure of a functioning modern society: jobs, a place to live, and the internet. It really highlights this divide where urban lawmakers perhaps view the countryside as this pristine theme park for weekend hiking, rather than a living, breathing industrial economy that requires actual maintenance.
Victoria Bond, who is the director of CLA Cymru, articulates this perfectly in the sources. She states that politicians who treat the countryside as a nice place for a walk simply will not win support. What this polling data is really capturing is a phenomenon we can call the rural cost of living penalty.
I really want to explore the mechanics of that penalty. Inflation and the cost of living crisis hit everyone in the UK, whether you live in downtown London or the Welsh Hills. How does the rural environment uniquely amplify that pain?
It's a great question. In a rural setting, distance itself acts as a compounding tax. If you live in an isolated village, you drive significantly further for employment, you drive further to get your children to school, or to access basic healthcare and supermarkets.
Because things are just spread out.
Right. And because public transportation networks in these areas are often sparse or entirely non-existent, residents are entirely captive to personal vehicles. This makes them hyper-exposed to fluctuations in global fuel prices.
And the earning potential in those areas is structurally capped, isn't it? The sources point out that employment in rural Wales is heavily concentrated in farming, tourism, and small local enterprises. You don't exactly have a bustling financial district or massive corporate campuses nearby offering a ladder of high-paying, stable jobs.
Exactly. You have a population dealing with inherently higher logistical costs paired with a lower overall earnings ceiling. And then you introduce the housing crisis on top of that, which 33% of voters flagged.
Yeah, why is housing so toxic in these beautiful rural areas? Is it just a lack of space to build?
It is more of a clash between local wages and external wealth. These picturesque areas are highly desirable for outside buyers seeking second homes, holiday lets, or remote working retreats. This external demand artificially inflates local property values well beyond what local agricultural or tourism wages can sustain. As the CLA notes, local families are being systemically priced out of the very villages their families have inhabited for generations.
And then, when a local developer tries to build affordable housing to fix that exact problem, they hit the planning delays the voters are complaining about.
Yes, the planning system often prioritizes preserving the aesthetic character of the countryside over the economic survival of its inhabitants. It creates this paralyzing friction where new homes or modern business spaces are blocked by years of bureaucracy.
So the CLA isn't just releasing this poll to complain, right? They have a very specific manifesto to reverse this decline. I read through their proposals, and it seems they are demanding a total architectural rebuild of how rural policy is handled.
They are. They're calling for a cross-government rural economic strategy. Historically, policies affecting the countryside are fragmented across different government departments. So one handles farming, another handles housing, another handles digital infrastructure. The CLA wants to break down those silos entirely.
They specifically asked for an expansion of permitted development rights. I have to assume this is their answer to the housing and business space crisis we just talked about.
It is. Permitted development rights allow certain types of building work or changes of use to be carried out without having to apply for full planning permission from the local council. By expanding these rights, the CLA argues that rural communities could rapidly repurpose disused agricultural buildings into affordable homes or modern office spaces for rural startups, completely bypassing the bureaucratic gridlock.
They are also demanding the establishment of a rural development unit with actual statutory powers, not just a think tank or an advisory board that publishes white papers, but a governmental unit with the legal teeth to align funding and force planning reforms.
And critically, they are demanding long-term secured funding for the sustainable farming scheme. Farmers cannot make decade-long investments in their land, machinery, or in environmental practices if the government's funding mechanisms change with every single election cycle. They need structural certainty.
That demand for structural certainty and an end to disjointed, contradictory policies, it actually provides a fascinating bridge to what the government is doing over in England. Because while Wales is demanding a unified strategy, the Environment Secretary in Westminster is about to drop what might be the most ambitious attempt at rural mapping in modern history.
Yes, on March 18th, the UK government is unveiling England's first ever land use framework. No. If we connect this to the bigger picture of resource allocation, this framework is a monumental admission by the state. It is an acknowledgement that the unguided free market, combined with fragmented local planning, is completely incapable of solving the geographical puzzle of a densely populated island facing severe climate volatility.
I look at the mandate for this land use framework, and honestly, it looks like an impossibly high-stakes game of Tetris. The government wants to use the finite map of England to simultaneously deliver 1.5 million new homes, execute massive nature restoration projects, build out a sprawling clean energy infrastructure, and somehow secure the national food supply, all at the same time.
The historical context here is critical to understand why this is happening. For decades, land management in England has been a zero-sum game played in the dark. A housing developer looks at a 50-acre parcel and only sees a suburban subdivision. A conservation group looks at the exact same land and sees a vital opportunity to restore wetland habitats. A farmer sees next year's wheat harvest. An energy conglomerate sees the optimal grid connection for a solar farm.
So everyone wants the same piece of dirt.
Exactly. And because there has never been a unified national spatial strategy, whoever has the most capital or the best lobbyists usually wins. And that results in a deeply inefficient and vulnerable landscape.
And the sources highlight just how vulnerable that landscape has become. We aren't just talking about abstract inefficiencies here. We are talking about the fact that 3 of the 5 worst harvests on record have occurred in the last 5 years. And a third of all arable farmland in England is currently classified as being at high risk of flooding.
We have managed our land so poorly that our ability to feed ourselves is structurally threatened by the weather. The land use framework attempts to rectify this by introducing a single spatial map of England's natural assets. It will utilize advanced data modeling to provide a definitive guide for decision makers. It will dictate where nature recovery will yield the highest ecological return, where housing developments can be placed without building on floodplains, and critically, Which prime agricultural land must be fiercely protected solely for food production?
There is one very specific, immediate policy win buried within this massive framework that caught my eye, and it relates directly to the clean energy objective. The Department for Energy Security and Net Zero is changing the rules around onshore wind turbines.
Yes, they are enacting a significant reduction in red tape. Farmers, rural businesses, and public sector organizations will now be permitted to install a single, small onshore wind turbine on their property without needing to endure the exhaustive process of applying for planning permission.
That is a massive lever to pull. It completely bypasses the local council objections that usually tie these projects up for years. But why focus on a single small turbine for individual farms rather than just building massive offshore wind farms?
Because it is all about hyperlocal resilience. By allowing a farm to generate its own clean power on-site, you insulate that food producer from the extreme volatility of global fossil fuel markets. It lowers their operational costs and secures their energy supply, which ultimately stabilizes the price of food for everyone.
But the moment you introduce a master map of the country, you invite intense ideological battles over what that map should prioritize, right? The sources include commentary from the Soil Association, and their vision for the future of British land is incredibly aggressive. Brendan Costello, their policy director, argues that the framework cannot just map where we farm, it must dictate what we farm.
Right. The Soil Association is pushing for a profound shift in agricultural output. They are demanding that the government set a strategic direction that drastically reduces the amount of land dedicated to growing feed for industrial livestock and poultry. Instead, they want that land repurposed to grow horticulture, so fruit, vegetables, beans, and pulses. They're also advocating for a legally binding organic action plan, establishing a target where 10% of all English farmland is managed organically.
I have to push back on the Soil Association's utopian vision here a bit. The Environment Secretary, Emma Reynolds, talks about avoiding false choices between homes, nature, and food through multifunctional land management. The idea is that 1 acre of land can capture carbon, support wildlife, and produce food simultaneously. But if you fundamentally shift the landscape away from industrial livestock and ban new intensive poultry units, which the Soil Association is explicitly calling for, you aren't just changing the landscape, you are attempting to socially engineer the British diet.
That's a very fair point.
You can't just mandate that a nation of chicken eaters suddenly consume lentils and beans without causing massive market disruption and huge consumer pushback.
You are identifying the absolute bleeding edge of the policy debate right now. The government is trying to balance long-term environmental idealism with immediate, gritty geopolitical reality. The sources feature insights from figures like Henry Dimbleby, who points out that abstract environmental goals shatter when confronted with global shocks. He notes that the recent conflict involving Iran caused an immediate spike in global fertilizer prices, instantly exposing the fragility of a food system reliant on imported inputs.
Jake Fiends from the Holcomb Estate echoes that exact sentiment in the text. He argues that how we use our land has never been more critical because we are operating in an incredibly precarious geopolitical era. Food security is no longer just an agricultural issue, it is a pillar of national defense.
And who actually manages that defense on the ground is changing. There is a deeply important institutional reform mentioned in the framework regarding the Farm Tenancy Forum.
Right. Because we often talk about farmers as if they all own the massive estates they work on. But the sources point out that tenant farmers actually manage 1/3 of all farmland in England.
They rent the land, they take on the operational risk, they invest in the soil healthment. But historically, because they do not hold the deeds to the property, they have had very little leverage in shaping national agricultural policy. The framework's commitment to giving tenant farmers a greater formalized role in policymaking is a massive shift in power dynamics. It elevates the voice of the human capital, the people actually executing the labor, over simply listening to the landed gentry.
Okay, so we've spent time at the macro level. We've looked at the politicians in Whitehall drawing spatial maps and debating the national diet. Now, I really want to zoom all the way in. I want to look at the microscopic, biological reality of a single farm trying to survive inside this exact environment. Let's look at the organic dairy market.
The organic dairy sector serves as the perfect case study here. It demonstrates exactly how high-level climate volatility and strict environmental regulations translate into daily, grueling operational challenges for a farmer. The sources feature a detailed analysis from Ben Trott, who is the organics product manager at 4Farmers, and he outlines a market that is defined by a razor-thin balancing act.
On the surface, the economic indicators he provides look fantastic. Demand for organic milk is growing by 1 to 2% year on year, and the prices farmers are receiving for that milk are robust. So standard economic theory dictates that if demand is up and prices are high, the producer should simply scale up production. Just buy more cows, produce more milk, and capture the market.
But standard economic theory rarely survives contact with agricultural logistics. The fundamental bottleneck in the organic dairy market right now isn't consumer demand, and it isn't farm capacity, it is processing capacity. The dairies and facilities that actually pasteurize, bottle, and distribute the organic milk are operating near their physical limits.
And the sources note this is particularly acute ahead of the spring milk flush.
Yes, the biological reality of the bovine cycle. In the spring, when cows are turned out onto fresh, nutrient-dense grass, their milk production naturally surges. The processors are already struggling to handle this seasonal spike. If every organic farmer simply expanded their herd horizontally by buying more cows, they would flood the supply chain, overwhelm the processors, and inevitably crash the price of the milk, destroying their own margins.
So the farmer is trapped. They have a growing market, but they are physically prevented from expanding their herd to meet it. How do they increase profitability?
They have to shift from horizontal expansion to vertical optimization. As Ben Trott explains, the only viable path forward is to make their existing herd hyper-efficient. They have to extract more high-quality milk from the exact same number of cows.
Let's talk about how you actually achieve that, because an organic dairy cow isn't a machine you can just reprogram. It's a biological system governed by incredibly strict legal frameworks. The sources highlight the golden rule of organic dairy farming. 60% of a cow's dry matter intake must come from forage.
We need to define those terms to understand the difficulty here. Dry matter intake is essentially everything the cow consumes minus the water content. And forage refers to the vegetative portion of plants, so fresh pasture grass, hay, or silage. Silage is basically fermented, high-moisture fodder, usually grass or maize, that is harvested, compacted, and stored in a silo or wrapped in plastic to feed the cows during the winter.
Okay, so by law, to maintain the organic certification and receive that premium price, 60% of the cow's diet must be this natural forage. They're only allowed to supplement the remaining 40% with concentrated feeds, like organic grains.
And this is where the macroeconomic mapping of the land use framework collides with the micro-reality of a cow's rumen. We discussed earlier how climate volatility has resulted in terrible harvests. The magazine specifically notes the recent run of challenging, unpredictable weather, particularly the deeply wet winters.
There is literally a headline in the magazine noting that the wet winter sets up crucial silage decisions.
Right. If your fields are waterlogged for months, the grass does not grow with the necessary nutritional density. When you harvest that compromised grass to make silage for the winter, you are storing a subpar energy source. If the baseline 60% of the cow's diet is nutritionally poor due to climate change, asking that animal to achieve hyper-efficient milk yields is biologically impossible. She won't produce the milk, her immune system will falter, and her fertility will drop.
So the farmer has to rely heavily on that allowable 40% of concentrated feed to aggressively plug the nutritional holes left by the rain-damaged silage. But I read the nutritional constraints for organic farmers, and it sounds like trying to build an elite bodybuilder using only strict vegan whole foods without any protein powders or supplements.
That is an excellent way to conceptualize it. In conventional dairy farming, if the silage is poor, the farmer can easily balance the cow's diet by adding synthetic amino acids, the fundamental building blocks of protein, directly into the feed. They can synthetically adjust the levels of methionine or lysine to optimize milk production.
But the organic certification strictly bans the use of synthetic amino acids.
Exactly. Without access to synthetic shortcuts, the concept of protein efficiency becomes a high-wire act of organic chemistry. The farmer must carefully select specific, raw organic grains, legumes, and pulses, blending them with immense precision to naturally synthesize the complete amino acid profile the cow needs.
And because certified organic raw materials are incredibly expensive, if the farmer gets the nutritional math wrong, they are literally pouring vast amounts of money through the cow and into the slurry pit without seeing any return in milk yield.
This is where sci-fi level technology is brought in to solve the biological bottleneck. Ben Trott discusses the implementation of robotic milking systems. We aren't just talking about machines that automate the physical milking process here. We are talking about data-driven, localized computing.
How does the robot actually interface with the cow's diet?
These robotic systems monitor every single cow individually. They read an RFID tag when the cow enters the stall. As the machine milks the cow, it analyzes the milk's volume, its fat content, its protein levels, and the cow's overall health metrics in real time. Based on that instantaneous data, the system's algorithm calculates the exact nutritional deficit of that specific cow and automatically dispenses a custom-blended, micromanaged ration of those expensive organic concentrates right into her feed trough while she's being milked.
That is staggering. We have gone from the pastoral image of a cow chewing cud in a sunny meadow to a real-time, algorithmic, closed-loop system adjusting organic amino acid profiles gram by gram to maximize yield all without violating a 60-40 legal forage quota.
It is the absolute pinnacle of biological and technological efficiency. But as advanced and highly managed as that microeconomy is, it remains incredibly fragile. All of that precision engineering, all that careful soil management and targeted nutrition can be obliterated in a single night by forces completely outside the farmer's control.
Which forces us to pivot from the heights of technological optimization to something incredibly primitive, destructive, and malicious. We have to address the epidemic of organized rural crime, specifically the crisis of fly tipping.
The statistics provided in the sources are not just concerning. They represent a systemic breakdown of law and order in the countryside. In the 2024 to 2025 reporting period, local councils dealt with 1.26 million reported fly tipping incidents on public land. That represents a 9% year-on-year increase, over 1 million incidents of illegal dumping.
And that number is just a fraction of the reality, because it only accounts for waste dumped on public property, highways, council parks, municipal lands. The Country Land and Business Association points out the massive hidden iceberg beneath that statistic, which is the vast amount of dumping that occurs on privately owned farmland, which doesn't make it into the council's statistics.
We have to clarify the scale of this crime. The term fly tipping often conjures an image of a lazy individual throwing a fast food wrapper out of a car window, or perhaps someone dumping an old mattress in a ditch to avoid a trip to the local dump. That is not what is terrorizing the rural economy.
No, the sources detail an incident in Hodeswood in Kent where 30,000 tons of waste was dumped in an ancient woodland. 30,000 tons. You don't move that much material with a pickup truck on a Sunday afternoon. Another case highlighted was next to the A34 in Kidlington, involving 20,000 tons of waste.
We have to look at the economics and the logistics of this to understand the why. How do you physically procure, transport, and dump 30,000 tons of material? This requires a fleet of heavy goods vehicles, coordinated staging, and heavy machinery to move the earth. What we are looking at is highly organized, incredibly lucrative criminal enterprise.
And what is the economic driver for these syndicates? Why are they targeting farms?
It is a massive arbitrage opportunity created by the UK's own environmental regulations. To legally dispose of commercial, construction, or hazardous waste in the UK, a business must pay significant landfill taxes and processing fees. Organized crime syndicates set themselves up as waste management companies, undercutting legitimate operators. They charge construction firms or industrial sites a lower rate to take the waste away.
But instead of taking it to a registered taxed landfill, they simply identify a remote, under-policed farm, smash through the gates in the middle of the night, dump thousands of tons of material, and pocket the entire disposal fee as pure, untaxed profit.
Precisely. It is an exploitation of geography. They know that rural police forces are stretched incredibly thin over vast geographic areas, meaning the response time to a midnight breach of a farm gate is virtually non-existent.
And here's the element of this story that genuinely defies belief. When a criminal syndicate dumps 20,000 tons of hazardous asbestos-laced construction rubble onto a farmer's newly planted wheat field, who is legally responsible for paying to clean it up?
The farmer. The victim of the crime bears the entire financial and legal burden.
I want you, the listener, to really internalize the sheer structural injustice of this legal framework. If someone stole a dump truck full of toxic industrial waste, drove it into central London, and tipped it onto your suburban driveway, the local council would not send an environmental agency to your door to force you to pay thousands of pounds to hire a hazmat team to clean it up. But because it happens in a field rather than a driveway, the state legally defaults to punishing the victim.
The CLA survey data reveals that each individual incident costs a farmer an average of £1,000 to clear up out of their own pocket, and that is just the average for smaller drops. The mega dumps can bankrupt a farm entirely.
The human toll of this catch-22 is captured vividly in the quotes from the farmers themselves. Colin Rayner, a farmer in Berkshire, describes a relentless weekly siege. He wakes up to find gateways blocked with car tires, white goods like refrigerators, hazardous chemicals, and even dead animals. He says his farm staff are effectively forced to act as unpaid litter pickers, clearing footpaths every single week and absorbing the high disposal costs at registered landfill sites just so they can access their own fields.
Another farmer, George Hurl in Cambridgeshire, describes dealing with washing machines, mattresses, builders' rubble, and large-scale process waste. And we must emphasize that these farmers are not passive victims. The sources note that 85% of them have invested heavily out of their own pockets in security measures, installing CCTV networks, motion sensor lighting, and heavy steel barricades.
But if a criminal gang arrives at 2 a.m. with a 15-ton articulated lorry, a seal gate isn't going to stop them. They just ram it. So the farmer spends capital to fortify their land, suffers the trauma of an organized criminal breach, loses the crop under the waste, and is then financially penalized by the government via landfill taxes to clean up the mess.
What's fascinating here is how this circles back to the political polling in Wales we discussed an hour ago. When 37% of rural voters express fury over the cost of living, and a massive segment cite rural crime as their reason for abandoning traditional political parties, this exact dynamic is what is driving their anger.
They are watching organized syndicates operate with impunity, destroying the land they are supposed to be protecting, while urban lawmakers look the other way. And then the state literally sends the victim the bill. It breeds a deep, corrosive resentment.
So how do we fix it? The CLA has laid out a very specific, aggressive set of demands to alter the legal and enforcement landscape.
First, they are demanding the appointment of a national fly tipping commissioner. The goal here is to stop treating this as a localized littering issue handled by municipal councils and start coordinating agencies like the police, the Environment Agency, and the National Crime Agency to target the syndicates systemically.
Second, they want to hit the gangs and their infrastructure.
Yeah.
They are demanding that the default penalty for fly tipping be the immediate seizure and destruction of the vehicles used in the crime. If you remove the heavy goods vehicles, you remove their ability to operate the arbitrage.
Third, they want strict liability enforcement applied to the original owners of the waste. If a construction company hires a shady contractor to dispose of their rubble without verifying their credentials and that rubble ends up in Colin Rayner's field, the construction company should face devastating fines.
And finally, the most immediate, practical demand, the implementation of a free disposal permit scheme. If a farmer is the verified victim of a fly-tipping crime on their private land, they should not be subjected to government landfill taxes to dispose of the criminal's waste. It is the absolute bare minimum the state could do to stop re-victimizing the community.
It is a bleak, infuriating reality. We have spent this deep dive exploring a sector that feels cornered. They are facing an inheritance tax wipeout that threatens their lineage. They are navigating a political system that feels distant and unresponsive. They are trying to fit their livelihoods into utopian, top-down spatial maps. They are executing the grueling, microscopic science of organic dairy nutrition just to keep their heads above water. And they are fighting off organized crime syndicates while the state holds them liable for the damage.
It is a portrait of an industry under immense structural compression. And yet, the most remarkable takeaway from these sources is that the industry refuses to collapse. Despite the taxes, the politics, and the crime, the agricultural sector continues to innovate at a staggering pace.
Let's conclude our deep dive by looking at the sheer technological resilience keeping this sector alive. I was completely captivated by the machinery highlights in the magazine, specifically the Vaderstad top-down and Opus machines.
This represents the physical manifestation of the exact kind of multifunctional land management the government's land use framework is demanding. The Vaderstad e-services system takes massive, heavy-duty tillage machines, the equipment used to prepare the soil for planting, and integrates them with satellite data and localized computing.
Explain the mechanism of how this actually interacts with the soil, because the concept of prescription maps mentioned in the text is fascinating.
Before the tractor even enters the field, the farmer uses satellite imagery, historical yield data, and ground-penetrating soil sampling to create a digital, centimeter-accurate map of the field. This map understands that one corner of the field is heavy, compacted clay, while a stretch 50 meters away is loose, sandy soil. This digital map is loaded into the tractor's computer.
So as the tractor drives across the field at speed, pulling this massive tillage equipment, what happens?
The machine communicates with the GPS and the prescription map in real time. As it crosses from the loose sand into the heavy clay, the e-services system automatically, dynamically adjusts the hydraulic pressure on the individual discs, tines, and levelers. It digs deeper and more aggressively into the compacted clay to break it up, but the millisecond it crosses back into the loose soil, it eases the pressure, barely scratching the surface.
Which means the farmer is only burning the exact amount of diesel fuel necessary. And more importantly, they're only disturbing the soil structure exactly as much as biologically required, preserving the soil microbiome and reducing erosion. It is the perfect marriage of heavy industry and microscopic ecological care. This isn't your grandfather's tractor. This is basically a giant soil analyzing robot that adjusts itself on the fly.
And we see that same marriage of agriculture and broader societal needs in the updates regarding British biogas. The magazine notes how anaerobic digestion on farms can physically shield UK households from Gulf energy shocks.
I looked into the mechanics of anaerobic digestion, and it is brilliant. The farm takes its organic waste cow manure, leftover crop residues, spoiled silage, and seals it in massive, oxygen-free tanks. Microorganisms break down the material and release biomethane gas.
The farm then captures that biomethane, scrubs it, and pumps it directly into the national gas grid to heat homes and generate electricity. The farm is no longer just a food production site. It is an active, decentralized node in the nation's energy security infrastructure. It is literally turning waste into geopolitical resilience.
There are also vital human elements highlighted at the end of the sources. The Use Your Head campaign is providing 100 free helmets for ATV and quad bike users, addressing the very real physical dangers of farm work with grassroots action. And finally, the LRSN being named Charity of the Year.
The Lincolnshire Rural Support Network. They provide specialized pastoral and practical support to farming families experiencing anxiety, stress, and crisis. When you synthesize everything we have discussed today, the terror of the inheritance tax trap, the psychological toll of climate-destroyed harvests, the fury of dealing with organized crime, you instantly understand why organizations like the LRSN are the vital beating heart of rural survival. They are catching the human beings who are buckling under the weight of these systemic pressures.
It is an incredible balancing act. I want you, our listeners, to keep this in mind. The next time you walk into a supermarket and buy a simple pint of organic milk, or drive down a highway past a field of wind turbines, or simply eat a piece of toast, you are looking at the end result of a massive, highly stressed, desperately fragile system. That food did not just appear on the shelf. It was wrestled from the earth by individuals navigating a relentless obstacle course of shifting legislation, volatile economics, biological constraints, and criminal threats.
The landscape is not a postcard. It is an engine. And I will leave you with this final, provocative thought to mull over. As a society, we are asking an incredible amount of our rural population. We are demanding that they be world-class, hyper-efficient food producers to ensure our national security. We are demanding that they serve as nature conservationists, restoring biodiversity and capturing carbon. We are demanding that they act as clean energy generators. And through the profound failure of our legal and enforcement systems, we are forcing them to serve as unpaid waste management facilities for organized crime.
We want everything from them, but we make the execution of those demands harder at every turn.
We are asking a very small group of people to solve our most existential national crises, while simultaneously passing tax legislation that threatens to dismantle their intergenerational heritage. The ultimate question facing us in 2026 isn't simply how we use our spatial maps to optimize the land. The true question is, at what point does the structural burden we are placing on the human beings managing that land become too heavy for them to bear?